tubing it up and jamming it with a little bit of information on codependency. I'm not used to using YouTube, but to get videos uploaded, be patient with me as I am figuring out Techland, which is not always my favorite place to play, as I always have to figure things out a little bit more so than a lot of people. And it's pretty bright behind me. Hopefully that is not too intensive, but it's giving a little bit of shining in the light, and so playing with that a little bit. So yeah, I want to do a little bit of a video on codependency for the workshop that is coming up. And there's a free intro dropping in together that's coming up for this Wednesday. And some of the topics that I just want to really drop into to really connect into whether codependency is something that you've dealt with or codependency is something that you have seen around you, is to just knock off 8 key components that really line up to be able to see if codependency has been a really big predominant piece in your life or someone else's life. And of course, codependency really comes in from a position where whatever our childhood's been, we are going to be rocking out some patterns, and those patterns are usually interconnected with things that we've had to try to move through, impressions, and alignments that took place from a very early age. So really between the age of 1 to 7, I feel like it's a pretty fluid level of information that's out there now in today's day, is we create one of 4 attachment patterns, and those attachment patterns are connected with what kind of nourishment, love, receiving, and emotional impact we actually had in our childhood. So from the element of whether we had our needs met when needs came up, whether we were allowed to have all of our emotions connected to when emotions came up, or whether those were pieces that were sidelined, or there was a message that those emotions or those needs were not okay, or whether it was a verbal or a nonverbal message. So we have paralanguages and meta messages that come through. If you just did my communication workshop, you would know what that's about. But they're basically subtle messages that are a lot of the time nonverbal, as it's only about 7% of language is actually verbal. And so if we received messages in covert ways that really landed into our sphere, we can also create a lot of these patterns. And one of the core things we can see is a lot of people that are narcissistic or empaths typically fall into the codependency category. They're just 2 of the same stick or same shtick, where one is a very clear dynamic of wanting to have needs met through the narcissist, where there is a dynamic of pulling people in to have those needs met, to be able to be highly functionable, and having someone come in to basically be the one that's a giver. Or on the opposite side, as being the empath, is the one that is needing to land in, or I should say the receiver of the giver, and so the empath is the one that is the giver. And how those 2 can lock in, and those patterns are very easy to lock into, where a lot of people will lose themselves in this type of dynamic because they cannot necessarily land in and see what's taking place, and how there's a strong element of needing to I see a truck moving around in the back there, being able to really recognize what's taking place as these patterns are unfolding. So 8 key components to really being able to land into codependency is constant reassurance and seeking. So we really see this a lot of the time with empaths. You don't have to be an empath to be running this patterning, but it is a very commonplace piece where there's that need to be able to be told that you're loved, given reassurance about how another person feels about you, how they see you. Being able to have these messages show up in ways that really come forward through actions and through motions, as well as through the verbal component. And so there's a constant need for reassurance that usually comes in if someone has a codependency that's taking place. Feeling responsible for other people's problems. So we really see this where the person who swoops in, it's like they want to take on, or they take on the load of the other person to try to negate some of the things that are happening, to smooth it over, to go in there and basically fix, solve, or shift what's taking place for another person. versus being able to allow that other person to move through whatever it is that's taking place for themselves. So there's the need to be needed to take on those problems becomes a very strong component there. Can't say no, so it's very normal that there can be a situation where people can really struggle with not being able to say no when something is a no. A lot of the time on a somatic level, there's a disconnect between the true impulses that the body's communicating to what is actually going to be chosen for that person. So you might feel a tightness in your stomach. You might feel yourself pulling back or compressing. You might feel a constriction around your throat, but yet there's still a component of making that decision to move forward and to support, help, or shift something, where the true message that's coming up is there's a message to step back and not being able to recognize that message. A need to avoid conflict. And so that's where there's just such an internal struggle, especially if there was a lot of unhealthy emotional components that were happening in childhood. The anger or the rager is a very common piece that we can see with people that have the codependency component that's taking place. So there's an inability to feel comfortable and to hold space for the darker emotions, the heavier emotions, and the need to avoid conflict comes up very strongly. So whether it be that the person removes themselves or they try to fix whatever it is that's going on, or they're so hyper vigilantly aware, almost like that element of walking around on eggshells, feeling like when an explosion is going to happen or when something's going to go off, that there's a hyper vigilance to wanting to make sure that there isn't going to be anything negative that's going to come about, and this need to caretake that situation. Do anything to hold on to the relationship. So there can be unhealthy toxic patterning happening. There can be abuse patternings that are happening, and that person will still lock in to try to hold that relationship in place because there's almost like a do or die mechanism that's happening within oneself of needing to latch on and keep something in place even if it's super, super unhealthy. I think of myself to this analogy I've seen where I've seen this picture floating around in social media where there's a crocodile and there's this little frog that's holding onto the tooth of the crocodile, and it's like holding on for dear life, but yet it's like freedom actually comes from the letting go. And how it's almost in these situations, if you're locked in with codependency, you can't actually see the relief and the freedom that comes from letting go and being able to allow yourself to transition out of these codependent patternings. One will only feel valued when they are needed. So especially in the helping fields, whether that be in traditional forms of doctoral or nursing fields, like anything that really lands into the holistic helping fields or healing fields as a general, you'll usually find a lot of people that are actually empaths and people that are sometimes locked into codependency. So the need to be needed, the need to have to fix, heal, shift, or change something for another person to feel valued, to feel needed, to feel wanted becomes very strong. And for those of you that are familiar with me and have attended some of my Conscious Connections women's circles over the last 3 years, when we go through and we do the agreements to set up the container for being able to ensure that you are in the type of container where you're going to feel safe, you're going to feel cared for, and you're going to feel that you can relax in and trust, one of those agreements is to not fix, heal, shift, or change someone else's reality, and that it's through sharing of our internal world that we actually come to realize our own truths, and through taking in and receiving and listening to other people's messages and the way that they're verbally processing their internal world, that we learn so much and we can land into more expansive ways of seeing ourselves and understanding ourselves in the world. And so that fixing, healing, shifting, and changing is a very codependent pattern of wanting to move someone into a different state than where they're at and not being able to handle that state of suffering if we're seeing suffering. And suffering can look like the element of someone being really uncomfortable, in discomfort as a general in different parts of one's life, or all the way to really, places of raging and anger, where that need to want to shift and change that component can come up very, very strongly. Very concerned with the needs and the feelings of other people, which is not being able to see one's own self. And so it's projecting that component forward. So it's, what does somebody else need? What feeling is coming up for them? And doing whatever one can do to try to ensure that that other person's needs are going to be met. And so it can be bending over backwards. It can be exhausting all parts of the self to really ensure that that person's needs are going to be caretaken in the way that one is wanting that to be for that other person, to maintain some kind of equilibrium with that person. And so it is very much about abandoning oneself to be able to be available for another person, and exhausting oneself to, a lot of the time, all extremes. And then on the flip side of that is not being able to even recognize or even become aware of or feel the sensations in the body or the mind, the way that the body is communicating, the way that the actual soul part of the self is communicating, to really be connected into the needs and the feelings that one actually is operating from and what's coming up to the surface. So that's just a little snippet and a little dive in, but to be able to really recognize, like, how do these pieces operate? How do these pieces come forward? And to be able to just get a flavoring of understanding the interconnected, interwoven nature of codependency. It's quite involved, and this is just a little tiny snippet and a little flavoring of what that looks like. So I want to do this little video today just to get a little bit more information out around this topic, and I look forward to feedback. I look forward to hearing anything that anybody wants to connect in with, any questions that come up. You can either personally message me or leave a message underneath the video. All right, so sending you lots of blessings into the rest of your day, and very passionate about this topic. I'm a personal growth, spiritual growth junkie, I would say, on many levels, and getting under the roots of these things is where I really thrive. So if you don't know me, I'm Katia T. Caven, and I've had a holistic practice going for many years, holistic coaching, counseling, somatic release therapy, cranial sacral, and shamanic and celestial Reiki and energy healer. And that's whether in person or distant. Those both operate under my field. All right, so sending you many blessings, and I hope this was a little bit informative today. Mwah.